figure out through things like broadcasting how we transition. So you remember All in the Family when it started.
Yeah.
It's a show that doesn't even run very much anymore because simply trying to address those issues is too hot button for most advertisers now.
You could never have an Archie Bunker character today.
But that whole show was part of society's attempt to transition from an era where it wasn't that long beforehand where you couldn't stay in a hotel that wasn't a black or a white person's hotel in the South to one where we got now. And I always thought, okay, the message of Archie Bunker was they would try to, teach him, the young people would try to teach him how to be a more open human being. But it didn't matter because the Archie Bunkers of the world were going to die off. They were the dinosaurs from another era, and eventually that would be a way of looking at things that was in the past. And I thought that was what it was going to be. And I never saw the resurgence, but like my Croatian friend had said, just maybe things had to get bad enough economically and whatever for all the tribal things to just come back because there's something deep in us that's all embedded in.
I think there's far less of those people now than have ever
they're
existed
louder
before. But that's stunned me too. And it's so homogenized when you see them with their fucking Home Depot torches walking down the street.
The tiki torches.
You fucking dorks. The whole thing was so goofy.
Well, did you hear Richard Spencer? He did the white supremacist, I guess. But he did an interview about 2 weeks ago where he was basically saying slavery was good and all these kind of things.
Oh, that British man?
Yes.
Yeah,
and the British guy at the end said something like, you're an idiot or whatever. Yeah, but I mean, it was a ridiculous thing to say. And yet normally, and you remember 60 Minutes used to have the KKK white supremacist guys in the old days on like once a year. They'd interview like the Grand Dragon or whatever, and they'd give him a lot of airtime, and Mike Wallace would question him. And at the end of it, you just always thought the same thing. These people are idiots, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was the give them enough rope and they'll hang themselves type journalism.
I thought that journalist, like everybody was talking about, that the guy did the perfect interview with him. But I honestly think that's not the way to do the perfect interview with him. I think that guy's standing up. They're standing up facing each other. I think they'd be far better off if they sat down and if they talked for a long period of time. And I think there's plenty more rope, and that guy could have hung him way better.
Yeah. There's a book by a black gentleman who's a musician, a boogie woogie piano player. I don't remember his name.
What is that?
It was a book on
boogie woogie.
Yeah, but it was
it's
a book.
Style?
It was a book on the Klan, and he was a guy, a black man who. I'm going from memory here, but he like set up an interview with one of the heads of the state Klan or whatever. Didn't tell the guy who was coming that he was a black man, and they had this interview, and it's this interesting thing he says. But long story short, he started to make friends with these KKK members, and it wasn't like rank and file people. It was like the Grand Dragon, whatever. That's the guy, right? Okay.
How one man convinced 200 Ku Klux Klan members to give up their robes.
Yeah, and basically, but long story short is, I mean, these were
Daryl
people.
Davis.
They didn't have any black people they knew, right? They had stereotypes and things. So he said, once you're, like you had said, when you're face to face with somebody and you have to interact with them on an eye to eye level, it's very intriguing what he did, because you say to yourself, okay, you can never reach these Archie Bunker guys, but people have and do. And I do want to say, listen, for all of the white supremacists out there that think I'm being unfair, this racial tribal thing is all over the place, because there are, like you will meet black folks who are racist too.
Yes.
Now, what I always say to people though is the one thing you have to understand as a white person that's different is we're the dominant culture. Okay? It does make things different. If you're a minority in any country, there's a tendency, I mean, you go to the place and they'll have neighborhoods, right? Remember the Italian neighborhoods in our country, the Jewish neighborhoods, the Irish neighborhoods. Why did they do that? Were they racist? No, there's some strength in gathering with your own kind, reading your own newspapers and keeping your culture
Speaking
alive.
your own language.
That's right. But it's also a self-defense mechanism, right? So it's a very different thing to say, well, listen, they're being racist too. Okay, but we're the dominant culture, and it means that there's something a little different when we say, what's wrong with saying, white people should be proud of their heritage too? Theoretically, nothing. But historically speaking, there are some issues.
Yeah.
And you need to recognize that. Now, can we ever get to a time when we can judge people by the content of their character? I don't know, but I think even if white people said we're going to do that right now, there'd be people of other colors going, no, wait a minute, we don't want to give up, some extra admissions into universities, and we don't. It becomes a very difficult thing to give up this racial identity. In the '60s, that was the goal. Now, people on all sides would be, what are you talking about? It's very, the cultural appropriation thing drives me crazy. Like if you're going to have dreadlocks, you can't because that's a black hairstyle. What I always want to say is, don't black people want to try different hairstyles too? I
mean, they do. Look at Beyonce.
Creativity is putting things together that never went together before. This is a good thing.
Not only that, it's not even historically correct. You know as well as I do that dreadlocks have been around for a long fucking time with white people.
But think about how it just polarizes us even more. If you really want,
it's not real though. It's people looking for things to be polarized.
Yes, and again, I do think, and I love academia, and I could have got swept up. I enjoyed school at the college level so much I could still be there today. I mean, I've never gotten a job. I would just be one of those guys. I'm a graduate student at 51 helping the professors. But at the same time, look, we all understand that those people are incentivized to come up with new theories, new ideas, groundbreaking, cutting edge. You know, this is what they're rewarded for with the carrots and sticks. So I get it. It's different when it spreads to the general culture a little bit, though, because now we're not in the ivory tower having a theoretical debate. We're sitting there going, should that person be shamed on Twitter because he's an Asian person with dreadlocks?
Right.
Okay, folks, if you don't see that might backfire on you down the road, I mean, we've all got to cut each other some slack on all sides if we're going to make this work.
Well, it's cultural appropriation is one of the things that makes America so fascinating.
Totally.
The melting pot of humans all together exploring each other's food and all the various aspects of their communities.
And the funny part is the cultural appropriators out there are sometimes the most sympathetic to that side.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're willing to get a Rastafarian's hairstyle, you're probably not an anti-black racist, right?
Yeah.
So when you tell them that they shouldn't be doing that, aren't you going after the people most likely to see your side of things and help you and push? And you see what I'm saying? It's almost like we're eating our own on all sides.
It is exactly like that. And on the left, it is particularly about eating your own because you can't be progressive enough.
Yeah.
There's always going to be someone who's more progressive than you.
But that's just how we are. You know, when I was a punk back in the old days, and I remember saying that we were killing the movement because the biggest thing was this idea of a poser, right? And the first thing everybody said, we didn't welcome you into the group. We said, when did you start wearing these clothes? When did you get that hairstyle, you poser? In other words, the entire thing was exclusive. Right? So you try to build this movement.
You have to be an OG.
Yeah, it was ridiculous.
And how many years do you have to be a punk for before you're allowed to be a punk?
That's right. And
can you go in slowly?
Yes. I mean, I remember them. They were going after like John Lydon, Johnny Rotten. You're a poser. Okay, well then what are we doing here? But I mean, in the same way, the one thing you have to do is cut people some slack. And the one thing we human beings seem to have such a problem with is cutting people slack. And it seems to be, if you say the social media, it seems to be worse because you'll cut somebody's slack face to face more easily than you will, you know, when you can just throw 140 characters and you go to bed, but that comedian on the other side of your 140 characters. I mean, you've seen this and I've seen this, but if you've never been on the receiving end of these things where people, and I've been very lucky and people have been very nice and kind to me, but even when you read these things, you go, who is this person?
Right.
And why do they think that this is... Did their lives get better because they texted me this? I mean, do you see what I'm saying? I don't get the motivation.
They don't even know it. They're
don't even know
thinking about it. They're just acting. It's a human instinct. They hurt and they want to hurt others.
That's what you told me years ago. You told me, that's what I said. You've helped me a lot when I look at those things, and I think Joe's right. Joe, this is people that are angry with their situation, and they're what did they say? It's like the crabs in a pot, and one crabs
in a bucket.
Yeah, crabs in a bucket, and you pull the crab down. And it's too bad because you know what? A lot of those people are the very people who could be doing much better if we could figure out a way to help empower them to unleash their
they get better.
thing.
There's people
they
that have been haters that aren't haters anymore. And unfortunately, a lot of people have already blocked them.
Or just that's right. Or just dissatisfied people that are so upset with the way things are. I mean, I would love to see more effort made in that regard because I think the subsidiary down the road domino effects would help us all so much. But listen, we're a country that can't even get the most basic things passed. How are we going to get something like that done?
I think change is happening. I think it's happening incredibly rapidly, but I think we're stuck in the mix of it and we don't realize it. It's sort of like when you come over someone's house and you haven't been over their house in like 5 years and all of a sudden their kid is 10. You're like, holy shit, you're 10 now? To them, it just happen gradually and slowly, and they barely have noticed it.
Yep.
But to you, when you take 5 years off and then you see that kid, you're like, holy shit.
The frog in the hot water thing, right?
Yeah. It's happening. It is happening.
But is it positive? See, this is where I can't, again, in the maelstrom trying to analyze, but is it positive or negative? Now, you're
both.
I was going to say, you're an optimist, Joe. We've had this conversation before, and I'm a little bit more cynical and misanthropic, maybe. But I worry about figuring it out. So if you say that human beings individually and as groups learn by mistakes,
yes.
Do you have to have a Holocaust-type mistake to come out of this before we go, wow, well, here's where we screwed up on that social media thing? I mean, I wonder whether we're going to be allowed. I don't know how you would put the genie back in the bottle. But I mean, at what point do terrorists or dangerous people, or I mean, look at to go back to that Weather Underground New Left bombing thing that I said that they didn't, the South, they didn't like me waterboarding Abby Hoffman. But I mean, if you'd have had a bunch of people back then with Twitter saying, I support the Abby Hoffmans, I support okay, at what point would the government, first of all, get you on a watch list then or now, but at what point would somebody have said, listen, for our own good, we can't have average Americans, because look how many terrorists are using this tool. I mean, we'll see what happens, but you'd mentioned 9/11 and how, so much of there was a feeling of community and all that other stuff, but there was other things too. There was the government literally, and I remember Peter DeFazio, the congressman up in Oregon, who said this to me. He said, Dan, there were bills that had been written and put on a shelf because there was no way to pass them for the longest time. And he goes, when 9/11 happened, they pulled all those bills down, cobbled them into one thing, and sent it. Yeah, and then he said, here's the real scandal, and most people don't know this. He says, do you know how many parts of that bill were blank that we signed to be filled in later? He said, that's not unusual. He goes, because we get a lot of bills that they haven't figured out all the details, but he goes, most bills aren't as important as that one. He goes, we signed off to a bunch of things with a bunch of blank categories to be filled in later. Okay, gets us back to leadership right there. What's wrong with the country? A bunch of people signing a bunch of stuff that have nothing in it yet.
Like I said before, when you're talking about, like, are you optimistic or are you pessimistic? Is it negative or is it positive? It's both. And I think the negative and the positive are both necessary. I don't think we're going to live in this utopian world where everybody's just friendly to each other. I think people are going to make mistakes. They're going to be shitty. They're going to realize that they're shitty. And the understanding of that behavior and the ramifications of that behavior is becoming more and more apparent every day. And I think we're seeing that. And I think we're caught up in this storm, and there's a fucking hurricane going on, man. This cow's flying by and bathtubs in the air. All this stuff is happening right now.
The hope is, though, that we can get to the good, because I might agree with you in the long term, right? If you're saying optimistic, real long term.
Yeah.
But how many, I mean, if you said in 1900, I'm optimistic long term that by the year 2000 things will be better. Yes, but you have 2 world wars to go through in the interim and near misses on nuclear wars. So I can agree with you that long term we may have a positive outcome here. I don't know what our immediate short term, with you and I have 20, 30, 40, you probably have 100 years left on your lifespan, but some of us are not in great shape. So if you said the next 20, 25, 30 years, are you going to see good or bad from this? We may have to go through some learning experiences, and those tend to not be so fun to live through.
Yeah, there's that, but also there's like, how about just disengage from that every now and then?
I do. I agree with you.
Don't have your life completely dependent upon the success and failures of other people's emotions and ideas. Like, just go off on your own more often. Spend more time by yourself, more time pursuing your own activities. Spend more time in nature with your phone off. Spend more time.
The nature thing's a really good idea, too.
It's giant.
Yeah, and you know what? Because, folks, that's what connects you to all the other human beings who ever lived before us. The thing that makes our time period different here, this vast human experiment, is we've never had a generation growing up with mobile phones, for example.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Well, one thing it does is it takes you away from the part that your ancestors, I mean, looking up at a night sky with nothing to do for hours, just sitting there contemplating the silence or the rustling of the trees or whatever. I don't know if you get anything out of that or not, but that's something that human beings have done since caveman times, that you're sharing an experience that's innately human. If that becomes less and less common because we're detached from that, what does that mean? And like I said, we talked about an experiment earlier, that we're in an experiment. What does it mean when people detach from that part of the human existence to spend more time in this new part of human existence? I don't know.
Well, I think that part of being a person, like being in nature, it's part of us. It's part of how we developed. It's attached to our human reward system. There's something that's deeply satisfying about lying down in a field and looking up at the stars. There's a reason for all that. And the more we detach from that, the more you're going to get these disenfranchised, very unhappy people that feel like they're a prisoner or a slave to some system that doesn't give a fuck about them, because it doesn't. It really doesn't. What the people that give a fuck about you are your community. They're your friends, the community of like-minded humans that you've bonded with, that share your occupation or share your interests. And that's how people develop satisfying relationships and satisfying lives. The more you put yourself connected to something that doesn't even value you, some huge monolithic creation there's no one even running it. It's not like some architect has figured out a great way to design civilization to satisfy all the humans that are a part of it. No, you're feeding this machine in some sort of a weird way that nobody really understands the ramifications of, because we haven't done it before. There hasn't been this global connection of cell phones for thousands of years. We know how to manage it. We know how to manage your time and all your emotions on social media.